Tim. Welcome to Watch You Want, and thanks for logging on. Well, the new year is still young, and with it come New Year's resolutions. And today, the resolution for all of you out there in cyberspace around the world is to service one of your watches this year. I'm here with Mike Michaels, Master Watchmaker. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Tim. Pleasure as always.
Mike is going to be answering all of your questions, everything you ever wanted to ask but were afraid to ask about watch service. Mike can answer it in detail, sometimes excruciating, and we've got a full suite of tools of the trade to show you how he does it. I want to give a shout out to our live audience as they're joining us tonight. Eddie Landsberg, you were first. Congrats, man. Noah R., welcome. William, Alexi, Joseph, J. Abbas, Spencer, J.L. Romero, Alex, welcome, guys. I know some of you are staying up late, some of you are getting up early to join us, and I appreciate that deeply. So, Mike, basically, watch service is almost like a black art, the way collectors look at it, especially those who are new to collecting. I think there's always the question, and this is the first thing they ask, should I service?
Yeah, I hear
should
that all the time.
I wait for a problem?
Don't wait for a problem. It's no different than a car. If you wait for a problem in a car, it's going to be really expensive. Your best bet is to service the watch regularly. And when we say regularly, now with the fully synthetic oils and everything else that we use in the watches, everything's fully synthetic. We're getting time frames 5 years plus in between service intervals. That not to be confused though with gaskets and maintenance service, anything like that for water resistance issues. We're just talking about the movements themselves.
And it's important too to just expand on that. A lot of people ask, should I wait for it to lose time? Should I wait for it to stop? And the analogy in automotive terms is that's like waiting for your engine to seize. Mike, I think you've seen some horror stories. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. The main thing, and just exactly what Tim just said, is when people say, my watch has been running great, I haven't had service for the last 20 years, it doesn't lose time. It has been losing time, you just didn't notice it. The main thing, but when it finally stops, if it comes to the point where it stops, it's gonna be expensive. One of the things people should look for are power reserve problems, and that's what we look for here as well. Before we sell any watches, we look at power reserve, and that gives us an indication of lubricants, whether the watch needs to be serviced or not. If you're not getting the full power reserve out of the watch, then yes, your lubricants are getting dry, and it's putting more strain on everything. The other issue is, we talked about this before, are automatic winders.
Yes.
And the automatic winders will put more strain on the automatic components on the reversing wheels. And we see that routinely when we tear watches apart. And those are some of the things we just try to avoid, and you could avoid that by maintaining your watches.
So essentially, what Mike is saying is that with service, you start with something that's essentially replacement of oils and a cleaning.
Exactly.
And as you wait for service and you go further down the road, down the rabbit hole, it becomes something that's a part replacement situation. Right. Whether you know it or not, you're taking something from routine service to service and parts replacement.
Exactly.
Now, in terms of chronometer grade parts, when you're dealing with like restaffing a chronometer grade balance, you're not going to throw that balance away, so you're going to restaff it.
You're going to restaff the balance, or in some cases, if it's an ETA, we're probably just going to replace the balance hole. But there are Rolex, we definitely will do a balance staff on a Rolex. There's no reason not to. We were, at one time when I was working on Rolex a lot, 10 years ago, some of the older 1530s, we were staffing those because it was the first time they had not been staffed. And these watches were 20 years old, and naturally they start to wear out. They start to get ridges on the pivots. They start to get ridges in the wear points because you have steel against the ruby. Once that oil's gone, that oil's your buffer. Oil's gone, you have metal against ruby, and the metal's going to give.
Yeah, basically the stone always wins.
Yeah, pretty much.
A question coming from Captain Zed, a longtime viewer. He says he has a Reverso 976. So this is a relatively recent modern caliber architecture. It's a manual version of the 975. He's saying, when I wind the watch, I have to gently bump or shake the watch to get the second hand running. Keeps excellent time once it runs, but is this a potential problem?
What it sounds like is, it actually sounds like a lubrication issue on the palate. It's not something that I would probably tear down to do a full service on because it is a newer watch, but that's an indication where the watch, one of the things they used to do when I was first starting out in watchmaking is, when we set the balance, we want to set it so it goes the exact same degrees, both directions. What they would do is they'll actually offset it, and so it actually jump starts it. And so you put some power in a watch. As soon as you put power in a watch, it throws the balance automatically. Okay. And now the watches are set at such dead zero that yes, sometimes it does take a little bump to get it going. But on the other side of that, it's usually a lubrication problem, and it's usually the pallet stones.
Okay, so the answer essentially is because it is a display case back watch, we're talking about the Reverso 976 here, taking it to a qualified watchmaker, he might be able to see if there's any problems with lubrication.
Right.
I mean, he should be able to eyeball that one. Okay, so now, here's a question coming from Alexi, one of our viewers in Europe. Don't worry, Alexi, we understand what you're saying. Okay, what, in your opinion, is sufficient beat error? At first, let's explain what that is.
We were just talking about
sufficient beat error to need to service or adjust it.
Well, beat error, that's you can knock your watch or you can increase your beat error by dropping your watch or bumping it in the wrong direction. And what that does, again, as we were explaining the balance, we want it rotating the same degrees both ways. We want basically 150 degrees both ways. We don't want 360, otherwise we get an overbanking condition. But if we get into 350 or 150 degrees each way at about a 300-degree rotation, we want it as close to zero as we can get. We get watches routinely that come in and they're at 0.5, 1.0, which means the balance is actually moved. One of the things we see in Rolex that has free sprung balances, the hairsprings actually shift. And every Rolex 3135, they pretty much shift the exact same way. And the funny thing used to be is we used to be able to tell if somebody golfed with a watch, because it would actually, the hairspring would all move the same direction if they teed off with a Rolex on the wrist.
Now, sometimes beat error, I mean, that can also be a result of a contaminated hairspring or a damaged hairspring. Yeah. How often do you see that? And also as a result of bad watchmaking, how often do you see that?
Well, if the hairspring out around is what we see from bad watchmaking, where we want to see the hairspring when we actually take it apart, and we'll do this in a later episode, we'll actually break one down. We want to see that hairspring. We want to see it centered with the cap, with this jewel, the top jewel here, or actually the lower jewel and balance jewel removed. We want to see that balance perfectly centered in there just by the spring tension itself. We don't want to see it riding on the side of the walls or anything. And that tells us that hairspring is centered. We're going to check that. We're going to check it for flat as well, because if the hairspring is not flat, when you go from position dial up to dial down, you'll see a beat error difference. So when we time the watches from dial up to dial down to crown down, if there's a big difference in the beat error, that tells us that the watch is actually, that the hairspring is out of round as well. So those are one of the diagnostics we can do without actually opening the watch up, is tell the condition of the hairspring, condition of the movement. And again, a lot of it happens just with age, but the other part of it is it happens with just the way it's designed and the abuse the watches take, because believe me, watches take abuse.
And if you're wondering what we've got with this little captive movement in a cup, it's my little ST36. It's a Chinese copy of a Unitas 6497, well known as the heartbeat of many a Panerai watch over the year. This is my own personal science project, just to play with in house. Learn a little bit more about
One of the funny things I can
watchmaking.
show on this is we actually time this watch out.
Oh yeah, let me zoom out there.
And we can show on this right here, this is the beat error we're looking at. And dial up and dial down, it's 0.0, which is as perfect as you can get. And in crown down, it's 0.1. So this hairspring is actually as close as you're going to get on this, and the numbers are actually perfect. You know, as nice as they're going to get on this watch with a delta of 4.1. Rate's a little fast, but the watch is running beautiful. But this shows the hairspring is just absolutely, it's as perfect as you'd want it.
Okay, so now in terms of milliseconds, which is how we measure beat error, what would be, to go back to Alexi's question, too much beat error for comfort?
I want to see 0.1 or less. We'll always move them to 0.1. They come in, if I see a 0.5, I'm not that concerned, because that's adjustable. That's just an very easy adjustment. If it's more than that, then we usually have to move the hairsprings. We know the hairsprings actually moved out of position.
Now, in terms of checking to make sure that the balance is completely centered, what Mike means is essentially at the center of the balance, there's a little roller table, and there is an impulse jewel, which is where the pallet actually interacts with the balance. And so the pallet stones interact with the escape wheel, and then on the other side of that fork, there's a smaller fork that straddles the impulse jewel that's on the balance and its roller table. By checking to see that that's centered and that everything's in line, you have the pivot of the escape wheel, you have the pivot of the fork, and of course you have that impulse jewel. When it's all in line and centered in the tines of the fork, that's what Mike means.
That's where we're at 0.
That's 0. That's perfect. Now, in terms of questions that are coming in, I'm going to field one that's more product-centric. I just want to make sure I give a shout-out to everyone. But Bob Schaff is saying, Tim, I'm wowed by the Journe Elegant, the Elegant 48. This is the new 48mm 2016 men's version of the Elegant women's line. No shame there. That's an awesome watch. Now he's saying it's pitched as a sports watch. I think it's dressier. How practical would it be to swap out the rubber strap for leather? In terms of swapping the strap, that's going to be a project for the FP Journe boutique because the watch is a very proprietary assembly. Everything from the movement to the case to the crystal to the dial to the straps that work with it are going to be Journe-centric. So if he offers a leather option, that's probably going to be your first bet. Now, in terms of its viability as a sports watch, yes, it has a screw-down crown. Yes, it's titanium. My personal opinion is that with 3 ATM water resistance, it's not a sports watch. It's a sporty watch.
I'd agree with that. That is a good analogy on that.
So now, in terms of other questions that are coming through, Alex Rosa has 18 years on an Explorer 2 serviced once when it was 6 years old. Okay, so it's an 18-year-old Explorer 2 minimum. Should it go to a Rolex or an independent watchmaker to save? I would say, first of all, you have to ask, does this independent watchmaker have the ability to get parts if this
Correct.
minimally serviced watch winds up needing them?
The problem with, I won't say the problem with Rolex, but some of the service issues with Rolex are great wheel. The great wheels do wear out. They get a little ridge in them, and it's a very fine. And if the watch, if you're not working with a watchmaker that's familiar with this, that knows the watch, they may think it's fine. They may think the great wheel is fine, and it actually increases the friction of the watch. You're going to lose amplitude on it. You're going to lose power reserve even after it's been serviced, and you're going to shorten the lifespan before the next service. And that's what we look at. A lot of the watches, 7750 especially, we take that watch apart. There's parts inside there we change if the watch is more than 5 years old because we don't know the next time that watch is going to be serviced. We don't want to put another 5 or 10 years back on those same parts.
And you know, this is important.
And same thing with Rolex.
With Rolex movements, I know they have a reputation as absolutely bulletproof. Different generations of them do have peculiar traits that sometimes require extra work. I mean, the post on the intermediate wheel on the 3135
post.
Explain that a little bit so they know what you mean.
Again, it's a lubrication problem. 3135 actually doesn't like to be set. And it's the second intermediate wheel underneath. The wheels are identical, but they're very small wheels. It's on a post on the main plate, and it actually cuts into the main plate. And once it starts cutting, it just grinds itself into it. And there is a repair for it, and that watch should go to Rolex, though, for that repair. And what they're doing, I believe they're sleeving that just to make it a little more durable.
So oftentimes parts needs arise in the course of routine service. The fact that you've got a watch that's had one service in the better part of 2 decades means it should go to Rolex. Or at the very least, if you're
Rolex certified watchmaker with access to parts.
Exactly.
That's up to date certified Rolex watchmaker.
They still exist, they're necking down, but there are still independent watchmakers with Rolex parts accounts. Now, this is a question from Kiki Fries, who's asking, what does Mike think of the various movement makers, including ETA, Valjoux, Sellita, Soprod, etc.? Let's start with the big one, ETA. What do they do well and what do they do less well?
The 7750 has been around forever, and that's the Valjoux. And it's a workhorse. It's not one of my favorite movements because of the thickness and they're noisy, but they work. They're predictable. They're easy to service. Whether it's in a column wheel version, anything a split second, they're still very easy to service. There's so many variations of 7750. I've seen them on a perpetual calendar module has been put on them. They're very, very, again, they're durable. You have the other ETA, you don't see as much anymore, the 2824, which is a model that I absolutely love. It's just so durable. It was built like a tank, very reminiscent to the Rolex 3035. Just very, very durable workhorse movements. They were a little thick, so they went to the 2892. The 2892 has been around since the 50s. Not in the 2892 version, but it's
evolving as both the 2824 and the 2892 did from Eternus.
Exactly. And so the 2892, it's a very good model, especially with the module on it. It's very, very adept at driving a module for a chronograph. And I'm a fan of them because they're easy to work on. Parts are readily available. They're very easy to adjust, and it's very easy to get chronometer specs out of even a non-chronometer based movement.
Now, if I could add something in terms of what Mike doesn't like about ETA, we had a great example from just this day. The 2894. It's the 2892 converted modular style into a chronograph. It's been around since the early 90s.
ETA's version.
Yeah. There's another one. You can get a 2892 that has Dubois Dupraz 2000 series module. Mike loves those.
Yeah.
But tell us why you don't like, from a service standpoint,
well, I think we have a picture of the assembly block for it. You need the proprietary assembly block, otherwise you cannot even assemble the thing. It has 4 retainers that actually hold the springs back. Once you load the watch together, you pull the plate off, the springs release, and it works. It's got a couple quirks when you go to set the watch. If the chronograph is running and you go to set it, the hour recorder tracks along. It just does some funny quirks. There's less parts in it. One of the things I really don't like is it actually has 3 clutches in it. And so you have much more drag inside that watch than you do the DD modules.
So now, Faline, if you could show us the movement holder. Yeah, that's the assembly post.
That's the assembly post.
For the 2894. And if you don't have that, it contributes to a spiraling maintenance nightmare. This is what happens when you take a 2894 to someone who's not tooled up and schooled up.
And as soon as they take it apart, they're not getting it back together. I think I have a picture too of it back together today, because I just actually did one today.
Faline, could you go back to the 2894? So the good thing is, Mike does actually know how to work on them, and we do have the proper parts, because we do actually have a parts account for that particular class of movements. But the same kind of problem, right, on the modular Audemars Piguet Royal Oak Offshores, when people don't know what they're getting into.
When they don't know what they're doing, they can be a nightmare, because when you look at the movements, they don't make sense like a regular 7750 or a Valjoux 72, a normal chronograph, CH27, something would make sense, how the parts work together. You have to understand the function, and there's really no explicit manual of how to put them together. They give you a blow-up diagram, which I want to bring on one of the shows as well, and to show some of the exploded views that we have to work with. There's so many variations with that module. That's what I like about it. They can make a couple simple changes and change orientations. They can add calendars. They can add complications very simply by adding 1 or 2 parts.
And now this is very true. And basically what Mike's saying is that if you know how to work on modules, they're great. But the problem is,
if you don't,
they don't have reduction gears, they don't have a power source, they don't have a conventional drivetrain. All the things that you're taught in watch school to expect inside a movement, they're not there.
Yep, yeah. Throw it all out the window. It's just a different thing. That's why a lot of people, a lot of watchmakers, a lot of people in general don't like the modules. I particularly happen to like them. I like the way the chrono hand sweeps so smoothly, just by the way the gear reduction is in it. It's just, that's what I like about them. It's just a very smooth action.
So now I'm going to quickly tackle a couple of other questions that have come up. This is one that's come from Jason Whitehurst, asking me my opinion on the Carl F. Bucher Scuba Tech movement related to reliability and sustainability long term. Jason, great news. That's an ETA 2892A2 in chronometer spec. So you are good to go with parts and service forever, and you're fortunate enough to have that movement in its highest possible grade. It can keep awesome time and put tourbillon to shame when properly regulated. Another question coming through. This is from Schwartz-Fabi. He's asking, what would be good picks for an extremely robust watch for daily use? Needs to be at least 100 ATM water resistant, and price-wise, the maximum at Okay, so 100 ATM water resistant, or do you mean 100 meters water resistant? Because 100 ATM would be absolutely huge. 10 ATM is 100 meters. 100 ATM would be, I'm a professional diver and I'm going down to the Titanic in a suit. So let's say price-wise his max is a Rolex sub no date level. Thanks and greetings from Germany. Schwartz-Fabi, I would say your best bet would be some sort of a Breitling Super Ocean, because you're going to get a nice solid 2824 in there. Bomber tough. I think, Mike, you'd agree, of the 2 basic ETA movements.
A great movement, like I said before. I love the 2824. A fantastic movement. It's a workhorse. In that case, it's basically bulletproof. It's a well-constructed watch.
And the Breitlings are specifically overbuilt. We have a lot of sayings about the Breitlings. Test them as incompressible cases when they go into the water tester. The way the bezels are put together, it's annoying for the decaser, but it's great because you can't just pop them off by hitting a door frame or drywall. Very tough watches, available at great prices pre-owned.
Fantastic price point.
Yeah, I think Mike and I both agree that's a winning cause, and many sizes available. Plus, look at the Super Ocean Heritages too, because although they're only 200-meter water resistant, I still think that's going to make I do think you're asking for 10 ATM, not 100 ATM. Yeah. It's definitely going to make the cut, and they have a little bit more of a sleek profile, vintage style, no crown guards. I think you'll like it a lot. So now this is coming from Luis, and he's saying, I heard of oiling a movement versus full service. Is there such a thing as a partial service?
I don't believe so. I've heard that term a lot. I don't like it because to me, the partial service is basically an escapement service. You're oiling one cap jewel because you can't get to the other one on the dial side. You're pulling the pallet out, you're cleaning the pallet, putting it back in, you're treating it with Epilon if you're here in the States, and you're putting a little bit of lubricant on it. That's it. It buys time, but it's not a service because you still have pivots, especially on the dial side of the movement, that are starting to run dry. And especially if they're dry on the bottom side of the movement, they're going to be dry on the top side of the movement too. So your best bet is to have that watch serviced, have it completely torn down, ultrasonic clean, fully inspected, get all that old lubricant out, and that's your best bet, is to replace it with the new lubricants, especially if your watch is 10 years old, because they were still using half the lubricants 10 years ago were still a blend. They were a synthetic blend, and what happens is the mineral part of it, those all evaporated, and then so you have a lot of dry pivots.
And so what Mike's saying is basically you can do a partial service on a watch at the point of the escapement, and that is the heart of the watch, but watchmakers are also very big on power reserve and running problems that are related to the power source. So when you go back through the drivetrain, you go through that fourth wheel, third wheel, the center wheel, now you're back to the main spring barrel, you've got an awful lot of potential plaque in that system. It'd be like changing the oil in your car, but leaving the old fuel filter, black transmission fluid, and a differential that's turned into tar. You're going to want to do the whole drivetrain to properly service the car, and it's exactly the same with a watch. Watch systems don't work in isolation. They only work as one mechanical organism, if you want to look at it that way.
Well, the other thing too, and it's an old saying, I can't remember who said it, where I heard it, but we could put men on the moon and bring it back alive, but we still can't make a watch oil that doesn't evaporate over time.
That's true, and it's even tougher with display casebacks and UV exposure. So moving forward, this is a question that's coming out, and I would say, this is from Noah R., but do watch brands ever upgrade vintage movements in their vintage watches, like service replacement parts that go into old movements designed to rectify, for instance, known issues after the fact?
Big manufacturers, I hope not. We know some other brands do, some other independents do. We won't mention any names.
We've discovered no
yes.
names named.
But yes, what the problem is, what a lot of brands are going to right now are movement exchanges, because what the Swiss have found out is that it's actually more cost effective than to actually just put a new movement in the watch than have it serviced. What we used to do, though, I'd rather service those movements if it's in good condition, because the watchmaker, a talented watchmaker, can get better numbers, as good or if not better numbers out of a watch, especially a watch that was chronometer certified. We have old watches come in all the time, and I like working on vintage watches. I like doing restorations. And whether we have to make a part, whether we have to source a part, anything like that, as far as the manufacturers doing that, I'm not aware of any that routinely will just upgrade a movement and change stuff out. They'll change stuff out because of obsolescence, but that's about it.
And here's the thing. There are vintage movements, and then there are late model movements.
Yes.
Like if you have the Omega 2500s and the 3300s, there are latest spec parts that the brand is absolutely going to put in. None of those qualify as vintage movements. Now, if you're talking about like your Rolex caliber 727 and an old Daytona, you've got like your 6263 with the 727. First of all, just don't send that to the manufacturer. Don't even try it. The worst case scenario would be that they actually accept it, which most of the time Rolex won't.
They won't want it anymore.
Worst case scenario is that they accept it and they start replacing stuff that's irreplaceable. I had a story come in of a Rolex GMT Master 2 first generation, and best case scenario would have been find someone to stabilize the dial. It went to factory service and the dial was replaced outright with the hands. Bad scenario, but that can bite you when you take a vintage watch and send it to the manufacturer. I'd say older than 20 years, find a specialist.
Yeah. 10 years ago, we were taking a vintage Explorers and replacing dials, replacing hands on them, because at that time they were in that transitional period. now, like you said, you want to keep them as original as possible. Collectors want to keep them as original as possible. When it comes down to luminous on hands, well, if we have a vintage watch, we'll pull the hands off. The first thing we do is we seal the back of the hands. We seal the luminous on those hands just to keep that luminous to match the dial. We don't want to change anything if we don't have to.
Yeah, and I'd also say that you got to know your brand. A Panerai that's 20 years old from the 90s is a vintage watch by contemporary standards. Those transitional B series watches that have the last of the tritium dials, I would even say service those exclusively with a specialist who knows what he's doing.
Yeah.
So know your watch, know your brand, and take care. It's more important that the historic fabric of a watch that's passed into obsolescence be protected. Movement upgrades, they happen with late model movements, but you don't want to see a whole lot of parts surrogates being placed in a vintage caliber. Now this is a question also coming from Schwartz Fabi, which is great because I think it's on the lips of many who are watching. But what does Mike think about Omega Master coaxial movements? Are they robust? This is the latest version, the latest series.
I haven't actually worked on one yet, but I do. If we've talked about the Omegas before, the 8500 itself is a fantastic movement. It is it's with the SI14 balance. The timekeeping's amazing. It's just they did a great job on that watch. They're easy to service. They're serviceable. The cases they're putting them in, Omega, they have a very, very strong product right now, especially for the price. We have a lot of those pre-owned as well.
Yeah, we have good deals on those. I will say, like, when we're talking about the master coaxials, we're talking about movements that are really only coming out in the last 18 months, like the 8400, the 8900 series, that put it all together with the new METAS certification.
Yeah, we had one in the other day. I did see one come through the other day. I think it was an 8900. And it was, again, I didn't get a chance to work on it. The watch is too new, but the timing on the watch was just fantastic.
Now, great question coming in from Jason Whitehurst, a longtime viewer and a customer. He's asking about the difference between chronographs, the ones that you can run continuously and ones that you cannot. This comes down to how the clutch is designed. Is it a lateral yoke or is it a vertical clutch? Yeah. Mike?
One of the things we see a lot too in watches we buy, and pre-owned watches that come in, we see it a lot on AP where people have a chronograph with a vertical clutch and they don't operate it. That's the worst thing that you can do. You have to find a happy medium somewhere. Keep using your vertical clutch, cycle your chronograph on and off. It's good for the watch to keep those lubricants flowing. Because when you have a modular chronograph like an AP, you actually have two separate movements. You have a base movement and then you have the module on top of it. The module is not moving. None of the parts are moving inside that module unless it's engaged. And so when you do go to engage it, as soon as we get a watch in, it could be 3 years old, we could tell if the chronograph never ran. We'll turn it on and Amplitude just dies because basically it froze up. The oils inside of it just dried up because of lack of use. So I like to see them operated. The vertical clutch, it slips. The people that understand what it is, you have one wheel that slips and you have another one around it. It's a clutch. And it's either engaged or disengaged. When it is engaged, there's no friction on it at all. It's actually just driving. When it's disengaged, that's when the friction is on the clutch itself. So again, it's important to have everything move. Cycle your chronographs on and off. Don't just let them sit stagnant, and you're going to be much better off and get a lot more life out of the watch.
Yeah, so in short, with vertical clutches, you can just run them full time. They will draw down your power reserve, but you can run them full time with no hazard to the watch. If you like that center seconds, you got like a contemporary 4130 caliber Daytona, you're good to go. But run them. The worst thing you can do is not run a vertical clutch. Better to run it full time and just wind your watch if you must. Now with the lateral clutch, my rule of thumb, and I don't know if Mike has a view on this, but I say don't run it longer than the largest register on the dial.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree, because they're not those. A horizontal clutch or direct drive clutch is not intended to drive all the time. It's a timing mechanism. That it was designed to be a timing mechanism. It's not designed to be a timekeeper.
Okay, so now a question coming in. If you buy a vintage watch, should you send it straight to repair? I'm going to lead off and let Mike finish this one.
It depends on what you want the watch for.
Yeah, this is a good point. This is a good point. You really do have to ask, is this watch a true museum piece that's just going to sit? In which case you're willing to leave it almost completely untouched. Think a Lake Erie Bugatti. Or are you going to want to run this watch? In that case, just assume every vintage watch you buy has never been serviced. Treat it like a grenade. Whenever you look at a vintage auction, there's always something to the effect of service recommended at owner's expense in the lot essay. I would say on that basis, Mike, if you just find an old watch.
Well, one of the things with a vintage watch too is you have to be careful are the old mainsprings, because there was at one time they didn't use bimetallic mainsprings; they were still blue steel. And I know we're running out of time, so I'll make it quick.
No, we're good. We can freestyle a bit.
We don't want to. The worst thing you can do if you have a watch that hasn't been serviced in 20 years is wind it all the way. Because if that mainspring lets go, it lets go. Yes, it's contained inside the barrel, but it's an instantaneous release of power, and I've seen teeth break. And again, it gets very expensive.
Yeah, a vintage watch is basically a project. You need to approach it as such. Ask what you want the watch to do for you and in your collection, and then find the best possible source for service who knows the watches, respects the vintage factor, and hopefully has access to the kind of parts that you may require.
We've had a vintage Daytona in here that, by all means, it looked like that watch had never been touched. It had never been serviced. So it was essentially a time capsule, and that was a watch that we presented it that way and sold it under the guise of I did not even want to wind that watch all the way because it looked like it had never been taken apart. It was a time capsule piece, and that's how we wanted to keep it. We wanted to keep that full integrity of that watch the way it was made. It belonged in a museum.
Precisely, and we expressed that abundantly to the seller, and he agreed. Now, in terms of what we've got on the table, we have some really fun stuff to share with you, and I want to end the night by going through some of Mike's tools and having him tell us what we do with them. This is deep stuff. We start with the screwdrivers, and we go all the way to pallet stone adjustments.
The screwdrivers are your average set of watchmaking screwdrivers. However, they're all fine-tuned, and I fine-tune these to each screw that I'm using. Today I was working on a Geneva Seal watch, so every screwdriver, every time I picked it up, I had to shape that screwdriver differently and fit it to the screws, making sure it's flat, making sure it's clean, making sure there's no sharp edges, because it's just as important not to damage those screws, not to have any marks on those screws when you're finished. The watch was in pristine condition, and it's still in pristine condition. It looks like it was never touched, and that's the idea. Some of the other things?
Yeah.
I have a palate adjuster. And this is something not a lot of watch shops have, not a lot of watchmakers use anymore. And it's for adjusting amplitude. If we have a low or high amplitude on a watch, we can actually, we use this to actually move the pallet stones very precisely.
And you can see the pallet stone is...
The pallet actually lives underneath here, and it's adjusted. You put one side in, entry stone, exit stone, and this actually will tell us how far we're moving the stones as we're physically moving it. And so it's a very precise tool. It's used for making very small amplitude adjustments, and I use it quite often. It actually goes on a hot plate, softens the shellac, and we use it often.
And when Mike talks about softening the shellac, he's talking about softening up the binding material that physically holds the pallet rubies in the metallic fork. And you can manipulate that at the micrometric level in the watchmaking workshop.
One of the other tools, and we use this again every day, this is the Horrea Tool. And the Horrea, these are the dies for it. And again, it's a very, very precise tool, and we use this for moving jewels. And end shake is another big concern in watches. The longer the watch runs, the jewels and the housings do move. They're rubies, they're just pressed in, and they move. And as those jewels move, end shakes increase, end shakes decrease, wheels move position. So we'll actually, as we're disassembling the watches and then again reassembling the watches, we use this to move jewels very, very precisely. It's a very fine tool. It's a very precise tool again, and it's used every day in the workshop. That tool is a lifesaver, absolute lifesaver.
And what Mike means by end shake is essentially the amount of room to
freedom
move up and down that the pivot for a wheel or a balance has. So there's obviously there's the torsion, it turns, but then there's also the vertical movement. If you can imagine it bouncing up and down in its pivot jewels, that's calculated by the watchmaker for optimum efficiency. He doesn't want too much or too little.
Yeah, there's specifications and all the diagrams and everything as to what the end shake should be, and it's being able to know what those end shakes are, because there's no real way to measure it. It's all visual, and we're talking about thousands of millimeters.
Now, in terms of the screwdrivers, just coming back to them because they're so fundamental, it seems to me like every examination, bench test, aptitude test, certification test in watchmaking starts with sharpening your screwdrivers. Why is that?
Because they want to make sure you can do it. It's a dexterity thing, and it's knowing the finish. When I trained in Switzerland, the first thing they asked me, they said, "We're going to show you how to sharpen screwdrivers," and I had my own way of doing it that I learned. and they showed me a different way. I showed them how I did it. We had the exact same result. You see a lot of watchmakers, they will sharpen a screwdriver lengthwise. They'll come down and get a lengthwise on it. What I do though is I was taught to do it across. And what that is, it gives me a little bit of bite, a little bit of tooth in here. So when I'm going down into the screw, I'm never reaching the bottom of the screw. I'm actually grabbing the sides of the screw. And that's one of the important things is screwdriver fit. It's not just having the screwdriver flush across the top, but it's also being able to adjust how deep it goes into that screw, because you don't want to bottom out. You don't want to scratch the bottom of the screw. And we're talking again about Geneva Seal watches or any kind of bench test, AWCI bench test. That's one of the things they look for, because if they see a scratch screw, they're going to look deeper for other neglect and other rough spots.
It's exactly like Mike says. There are a lot of tests where you're allotted like one scratched screw beyond two scratched screw.
Yeah.
Like these are the aptitude tests for
Horrea
watchmakers.
exam, I was allowed one scratch screw.
And so Mike even has strong opinions on using very soft beryllium screwdrivers, which are used for polished screws, for blued screws, versus his conventional steel. And his philosophy, explain to me why you don't endorse beryllium screws.
I don't endorse them because in a way it's almost cheating. If you can't dress a screwdriver optimally to fit inside that screw, then you probably shouldn't be working on that high end of a finish.
So what Mike's saying is you're going to shape that screwdriver enough so that you can manipulate the screw. You're going to bespoke sharpen that screwdriver. And the idea is that it should sink just enough into the slot to bite, but not enough to hit the bottom of the well.
You're grabbing the sides of the screw, you're not going all the way to the bottom. You look at the screw, you see the slot in the bottom. The idea is not to reach the slot. It's to work on the edges.
Okay, so I'm going to let Mike end us on a couple of quick questions from the crowd. This is first, okay, from B-Wave. Can an airport security scan and the X-ray for a carry-on magnetize a Rolex?
I haven't heard of that happening. I heard people talk about that. There are other ways to magnetize watches. We see it a lot. I think you're more apt to get it magnetized from a magnetic catch on a purse. Something like that, a magnetic catch somewhere, or where you set the watch down. If you set it down on top of a cable box, something like that, then you'll get it magnetized.
Yeah, definitely. There are a lot of other ways to magnetize your hairspring, as far as we know, and this is what I've heard as well. Yeah. X-ray scanners will not do it. And by the way, if you've got the SI14 Omegas,
you don't have to worry about it.
Exactly. Also, Chad Dixon, I want to greet you. Hi from Mississippi. I talk about our far-flung viewers, east and west, but you know what? We love you guys from the heartland in the south, too. USA. Also want to answer a question coming from Chad Dixon. Is there a preferred way to store or lay your watch?
No, I don't see there is. Actually, a funny story about that is when you go back to the old bull of Accutrons.
Yes.
They were actually timed in different positions, so you can actually slow the watch down by setting it down in a certain position.
Oh, yeah.
And that's how you would re-zero the watch. If the watch is a couple seconds fast a day, you could set it down a certain position, and that would actually slow it down. But no, I don't see any, there's no rotation. As you're wearing the watch during the day, you're in different positions all day. When you take it off at night, the watch is sitting for 8-10 hours. It's going to be sitting in one position. You're going to pick it up, and it's going to be all over the place again. So I don't think it really matters.
Yeah, the one thing is, if your watches are going to sit, wind them fully at least once a month. Yeah. That's what every watchmaker brand. That's what I recommend.
Yeah, I do too. It keeps the lubricants flowing. It keeps everything from getting stagnant.
And also coming from Jay Sykes, he's saying, Mike, Bergeon tweezers or pliers for spring bars?
Spring bars, I actually use my own spring bar tool that I made. It's just a larger screwdriver with a V-notch stuck in it. And I can get in there and just grab a spring bar and pull it right out. So that's what I use personally. There's a lot of different tools. There's actually spring bar tools that compress them. Breitling had one. They designed one that actually compressed the spring bars. Whatever you're comfortable using, and you're not going to scratch the case. I think that's the best way to do it. Real quick, if we're talking about tweezers,
yeah,
I did put a picture of the tweezers up.
Faylene, if you could call up our tweezer graphic real quick.
One of the most important tools in watchmaking are having our tweezers. And those of you that ever do see me on Instagram, on all the pictures, I always show my tweezers. My tweezers are all tagged, labeled, and it's because they're comfortable to me. If I pick up somebody else's tweezers, I know they're not mine. All the tweezers shown here, they all have different tips, they all have different finishes They're all used differently, and I use every one of them every day. For servicing a watch, I'll pick up every one of those tweezers to use a different part on that watch. And again, it's some of them are nickel, some are bronze, and it's just no marks, no scratches, fine adjustments, hairsprings, hands, cap jewels. They're used for everything. It just runs the gamut. It's not like a one size fits all.
Also, I had a request for a wrist check. Actually, we're both wearing blue-themed watches tonight. I've got my, I'm going to zoom in, my Master Grand Memovox, and Mike has his Tudor Heritage Blue Chrono. So I'm wearing the Perpetual Calendar Alarm Watch with a moon phase, and Mike's wearing the Tudor Historic Tribute. I think that's a modular ETA caliber in there.
Yes, it's the 2892 with a module.
So we like our watches blue tonight here at Watch You Want. I also want to give a quick shout out to Eric, who's saying that his Accutron Astronaut is gaining time, so he'll try flipping it over on each side. That's a good thing to do because the Accutron, especially the Bulova one, is more susceptible to positional variation. That's why the original Bulova Accutron, you know, the calibers 214, 218, and so on, could not make a chronometer certification because they were so incredibly deviant in one particular position. But the later ESA built Omega 300 Hertz tuning fork watches, also Max Hetzel, the guy who invented the Accutrons, those could meet the chronometer specifications and pass the test.
Yeah, the best thing to do is not knowing what position you're slow in. It's going to be a trial and error, unless you have an Accutron timer, which will actually tell you how you're running. But without that, you're just, lay it down. If you gain time, you're in the wrong position. And just trial and error, figure it out, and once you figure it out, just remember it, and you can set that watch down, and you can either speed it up one way, excuse me, or slow it down in another position.
Yeah, in all likelihood, it's going to be either what would conventionally be like crown high or crown low, because the way the tuning fork is arrayed horizontally across the dial, it's going to be moving like this in one position, and it's going to be moving like this in the other. So it's probably going to be
like a beat everything.
Exactly.
It's either going to be hanging low or it's going to be hanging high if you flip it the other way.
Do your ears hang low? So, guys, I want to thank you all for joining us. Again, always email Tim at Watch You Want with questions. We can continue this discussion. Mike's going to be back, hopefully next Wednesday.
Yeah, that's what we're going to try to shoot for.
So, again, Tim at WatchYouWant.com. Email your questions, watchmaking, watch knowledge, history, or otherwise. We'll get to them on our program. I also want to call out to everyone who's watching. If you like this content, subscribe to our channel. It's something I've never really done, and people have been asking me, Tim, you have a lot of views, why don't you have as many subscribers? And I'm like, I've never really pushed it. So if you're out there and you like what you see, subscribe and join us on a regular basis. I want to thank Mike Michaels. I want to thank my producer, Faylene Jerome, who keeps me on time and on topic. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. I'm Tim, he's Mike, this is Watch You Want, and thanks for logging on.